spend any time in Berlin, you realise it's a weird looking town. Every street, like this one here in Kreuzberg in former West Berlin, there's a kind of a mishmash of different styles. To see Berlin, to really see it, you need context. Now Berlin's such a heavily studied city and so kind of eminently quotable that we often see it through the eyes of others. But if you could choose one person through whose eyes to look at Berlin, you could do worse than Mark Twain. Now Mark Twain lived in Berlin in the 1890s, 1891 to 1892. And in fact, he lived right here for those months. Now Mark Twain came up with some great quotes about Berlin. He called it an illuminous centre of learning, a wonderful city. He also said that a man can learn everything in Berlin except German. But one of the things he said was that Berlin was the newest city he'd ever seen. Now, for a man who was coming from America, young America from the New World, that's a strange thing to say about a European capital. So why was it so new? Now, the reason that the Berlin Twain saw was so new is it was rebuilding. And it was rebuilding to cope with fundamental changes that had swept the world that had finally arrived in the city. In fact, 2 decades before Twain's arrival, Berlin had become, for the first time, the capital of a united Germany. Perhaps more importantly, though, the new industrial economy had arrived and Berlin's population was growing. Berlin would expand to deal with this. The districts in the south, in the west, and in the north of the city today are a product of this relaunch. Berlin's population was growing so fast, doubling every decade at the beginning of the 20th century, that there were entire villages of homeless economic migrants who come to Berlin, and they were living in villages on the edge of the River Spree, on the borders of the district today of Moabit, but they were living in villages of upturned boats. Berlin was once described as a city that was always becoming, but never to be. But what Twain saw was Berlin becoming the 6th largest industrial metropolis on the planet, and it would do that in less than one lifetime. This new world demanded a new vision, and that new vision demanded new architecture. Out with the old, in with the new, and it was with that sentiment that Berlin modern architecture was born. Now, Berlin modern architecture is both a response to and a vision for a new world. And within that vision, there were gleaming temples of industry, skyscraping, steel-framed commercial blocks of optimism, and importantly, domestic houses, clean and modern for we, the people. It's worth remembering, of course, that architectural style is simply a matter of taste. No style is better than any other. But Berlin's modern architecture is a story with a very important legacy. First up, today, the bulk of domestic architecture in Berlin is part of this new architectural style and vision born just over 120 years ago. But also, it's a vision that's born before and continues after the great conflicts of the middle of the 20th century. So it's a very Berlin story. It's bound up in visions for the future, but also within it, memories of the past. Buildings are the face of a city. That face, those buildings, will show you what a city in the past wanted to be. Some of the most famous architects, in fact the bulk of the most famous architects in the world globally, have worked in this town. All architectural repertoires have been tried here, which is what makes Berlin so interesting. We're going to be focusing on that modern architecture before and after the Deluge, and we're going to do that here in West Berlin. It was in West Berlin where this new vision over 120 years ago was born and is most visible today, and we're going to think about its legacy after the damage of World War II. And we're going to do that by first examining 2 buildings that give us an idea about how to read Berlin's architectural face. Now, the 2 buildings we're going to look at are important for a variety of reasons. The first of them is this is the Schloss Charlottenburg from 1699. The second building is the Reichstag Parliament building from 1896. Both of them are important architecturally because they show in their style at 2 very important phases in Berlin's life. The face that Berlin wanted to show itself, its people, and the rest of the world. So, for example, the Schloss Charlottenburg, this neo-Baroque building shows that Berlin is a European city. But perhaps more significantly for the rest of the planet, The Reichstag, finished in 1896, symbolises united Germany's new capital, Berlin, and its desire to become a global city. They've both got various things in common. Architecturally, they're both rooted, the style, in Renaissance classicism. And that's important because for centuries, if you look at other European cities outside Berlin, and there, away from Berlin, they're better preserved because, of course, you need to factor in the damage from World War II. Neoclassicism is something that you see all over European cities. And in a way, it's important because it's an expression of order and power. Now, it's not just the Prussian royal family's desire to connect themselves to the glory days of ancient Greece and Rome, those golden centuries that thought and defined our world, even until today. It's about order, but also about power. And those buildings, those that encourage you to look upwards, it's the power to those that built them and an expression of the power of those that sit at the top with everybody else below. It's exactly this type of classical ornamentation that Berlin modern architecture sought to drop. And that's a result of the fact there'd been, in Germany and Berlin, a huge power shift at the beginning of our new world, at the beginning of the 20th century. And Berlin modern architecture would express that. They got something else in common, and it's this. Both our buildings were built in West Berlin. Both were destroyed by World War II. Both were rebuilt after World War II, and both have redefined functions today. So that story of continuity, of memory, of forgetting, very Berlin story, is bound up also in these two buildings. Now this, the Schloss Charlottenburg, was commissioned by the first king of Prussia, Frederick I. In fact, that statue there, that's his dad. It was built for his second wife, Sophie Charlotte. She lived here, and that central section with the tower was the first bit built. The palace and this district, Schloss Charlottenburg, were named after her. The architect was a guy called Nering, and this building is a copy of the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. So what Berlin was trying to do with this neoclassical style building was to draw a parallel between it and other more established royal European powers. So, the Habsburg Vienna, this is a copy of the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. The gardens were inspired by Versailles. So, the Austrian Empire, the glory and pomp of pre-revolutionary France. Berlin is trying to say we're a European city, Prussia's a European power, and these buildings will express that depth of history and that positive European power future. The problem was, this is really mimicry in stone, because when it was built, Berlin was not a European city and Prussia was not a European power. But 86 years later, it would be. In 1786, Berlin awoke from its dream of European power to find that it had achieved it. Then it fell back to sleep and suffered a serious nightmare called the French Revolution and the arrival of Napoleon. Frederick the Great, the grandson of Frederick I, who commissioned the Schloss Charlottenburg, his wars had expanded Prussia. Britain and France had bankrupted themselves as dominant European powers with their adventures in the New World. A power vacuum had opened up, and Berlin would gladly fill that void. 110 years later, Germany had been unified under the control of Berlin and Prussia, and this house was built and finished, the Reichstag. Architecturally and its function expresses the contradictions of the time. One world was dying, and a new world was already being born. On the one hand, this is the people's house. It says so above the front door. It says to the German people, but those words weren't added until 1916. And today, even now, above them, there is a crown. Just like above the old dome of steel and glass, there was also the crown of the Hohenzollern family, now the imperial German family. The people's house where the people had no voice. In terms of form, you can also see the contradictions of the time. This building is broadly classical, it's broadly historic, it's broadly looking backwards. In a way, it's like a medieval castle dressed for a toga party. But there are elements of the modern world to come already incorporated into the building. Was the steel and glass dome not influenced by the recently built Crystal Palace in London or the Eiffel Tower in Paris? By 1918, this building would represent the death of the old order and that old world. And our new world expressed by our modern Berlin architecture, its time had come. It was now concerned with the dreams of planned cities for we the people. The temples of industry, the gleaming skyscrapers of commerce. And it's in West Berlin where this first phase of Berlin modern architecture is most tangible. Architecture is a bit like poetry. Beyond the actual vocab, there's something that each one of us can find meaningful. Something we can perhaps understand, but might have trouble fully explaining. Before the Deluge, Berlin's modern architecture, its verses spoke of its roots, the canon from which it grew. But the vision of the world that it expressed would not be realized until after.